The rain fell on the city that night as though the sky had bottled up its anger for a very long time, and only tonight chose to pour all of it onto the narrow streets of Hadley. Through the black water that carried off shattered light, a woman trudged in silence, dragging behind her everything that remained of a life. Delia Hartwell gripped the strap of her mother's worn medical bag. Her other hand clenched around a small suitcase as it slid through the puddles. Inside was nothing of value to the world, a few old clothes, a stopwatch her mother had once used to count the heartbeats of the sick, and a notice of termination whose ink had not yet faded. But to her, it was the whole world, all that was left. At 27, she had lived long enough to understand one bitter truth. This city never spared a place for those who stumbled. 3 weeks earlier, the hospital had pushed her out the door, only because she dared to say that a renowned doctor had prescribed the wrong medication, and a human being had died because of that mistake. People believed the diploma on the wall, believed the tailored suit. She had only her hands that had kept so many hearts beating, now trembling with cold, useless in the rain. She sank down beneath the awning of an abandoned building, holding the medical bag to her chest as though holding the hand of her departed mother. Tonight was not the end. At least she was out of the rain. Then, from the alley across the street, came a sound. The dry clash of metal, a stifled groan, then the sound of a body collapsing. When Delia dared to look through the rain, she saw 3 figures, 2 standing, one on his knees. And then, within a few heartbeats, everything reversed. The one who had seemed about to fall slowly rose to his full height, his movements decisive and cold enough to make her forget to breathe. The other 2 fled into the darkness, as though running from something more frightening than death itself. The remaining man stepped out beneath the light. Tall, broad-shouldered, a dark coat soaked through clinging to a hardened frame. He walked with a faint hitch in his left leg, the mark of an old wound. At the corner of his mouth was a dark smear, and with a professional's eye, Delia knew at once. It was not his own blood. He stopped, turned his head slowly, and looked straight at the place where she crouched in the shadows, as though he had known she was there all along. "You won't be needing that." His voice was low and rough, like metal grinding on stone. His gaze passed over her hand clenched around the scissors in her pocket, then settled on the bag she held to her chest. And those eyes, not the eyes of a predator, but sunken deep, threaded with red, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had gone far too long without a single decent hour of sleep. "You're a nurse." It was not a question. He was silent for a long while, rainwater streaming from the brim of his coat. Then he said the thing she would never afterward forget. "I'll pay you any price," he said quietly. "Just do one thing for me. Sit beside me until the sun comes up." And in Delia's mind there remained only a single question. A man who had just sent 2 others fleeing without daring to look back, what could he fear in the dark? So much that he would beg a stranger to stay at his side until dawn. Subscribe to our channel and journey with us through stories of healing. Where kindness always finds its way home, the offer hung suspended between them, heavier than the rain pouring down around them. Delia didn't move. Every nerve in her body was screaming one single thing: get up, grab the suitcase, disappear into the dark street before it was too late. She had heard enough sweet words from men in her life, and she had learned that behind every invitation, there was usually a price women like her couldn't afford to pay. A man who had just made 2 attackers flee into the night wasn't the kind of man a sensible girl should follow home. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, her feet already on the verge of retreating. But then she looked at him more closely, and that look changed everything. The man could barely stand. He was trying to hide it, his shoulders still squared, his chin still lifted, but Delia had spent too many years beside sickbeds not to recognize those signs. His weight was shifted too heavily to one side. His right hand hung loose at his side, and along the dark fabric of his sleeve, a spreading stain was blooming, darker even than the rainwater. His breathing was shallow and quick. When the streetlight swept across his face, she saw his skin turning gray, his lips going pale, that same shade she had seen on patients who had lost more blood than they realized. This man was exhausted, and he didn't even know how far gone he was. She hated that. Hated the part of herself that refused to turn away. Her mother used to say that a real nurse couldn't close her eyes to someone who was bleeding, no matter who that person was, no matter what the circumstances were. It was both the gift and the curse of this profession. And right now, standing in the rain with a dangerous stranger, she felt that curse stretching tight inside her chest. Her survival instinct told her to run. Her professional instinct held her in place. For a few heartbeats, the two struggled against each other like opposing currents of water. In the end, she let out a long breath, and her professional instinct won. "It always won your arm," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "You're losing blood. If you stand here another 10 minutes, you'll pass out before you make it anywhere." The man frowned slightly, as though her words were the last thing he had expected to hear. "I don't need a doctor. Lucky for you, I'm not a doctor. I'm a nurse." She rose to her feet, set the suitcase aside, and pulled her mother's medical bag forward. "And I'm going to bandage that wound for you. That's all. Not because of your strange offer, not because of your money, but because I can't stand here and watch someone bleed in the street, then turn my back and walk away. Do you understand?" For a moment there was silence. Then the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite into a smile, but into the look of surprise worn by a man who had gone a long time without meeting anyone who dared speak to him in that tone. He removed his overcoat with difficulty, revealing the tear in his upper arm. Delia knelt beside him beneath the narrow awning, and her hands immediately returned to work so familiar she didn't need to think. She cleaned the wound, pressed down to stop the bleeding, took a roll of bandage from the bag, and wrapped it tightly. The fingers that had been trembling from the cold grew steady again, precise and gentle. In that moment she was no longer a woman who had lost her home and her job. She was herself again, the woman her mother had shaped her to become. "Done," she said, tying the final knot. "You need a few stitches, but this should hold until morning." He looked down at the neatly bandaged arm, then looked at her, longer than necessary. "You refused my money," he said, as though it were a riddle he still hadn't solved. "I refused your money." "Then what do you get out of this?" Delia packed the bag again, stood, and pulled the collar of her thin coat higher against the wind. "Nothing at all. Sometimes people do something simply because it's the right thing to do. I know that must sound foolish in your world." The man didn't answer right away. He only looked at her standing there, soaked through, shivering, with no roof to return to, and yet she had just refused the very thing most people in the world would be willing to trade their dignity to possess. And in those tired eyes of his, something shifted faintly, a small glimmer of light he himself had not yet had time to name. "It's still raining," he said softly, almost to himself. "And you have nowhere to go." She should have said no. She should have thanked him for the awning, then found some corner of a train station to survive the night the way she always had. But the rain wouldn't stop, and the cold had seeped all the way into her bones, and the naked truth was that she truly had nowhere left to go. So when a black car glided to the curb, silent as a shadow, she only tightened her grip on the suitcase and followed him. The driver didn't ask a single question. He merely gave the man a slight nod and opened the door. Inside, the car was warm and clean, with the faint scent of expensive leather lingering in the air, and Delia sat tucked into one corner, sharply aware of her soaked clothes and mud-stained shoes in the middle of such a scene. No one spoke for the entire ride. The man rested his head against the window and closed his eyes, but she knew he wasn't asleep, because his fingers kept tapping a steady, restless rhythm against his knee, the rhythm of someone who had never once allowed himself to truly relax. The car stopped in front of a building that rose so high Delia had to crane her neck to see the top, and then an elevator carried them upward, higher and higher, so high her ears began to ring, until the doors opened onto a vast space perched above the city, where all of Hadley spread out beneath them like a glittering carpet of lights behind the veil of rain. She had cared for wealthy people in large houses, but she had never stood in a place like this, a place where even the silence had the smell of money and power. And yet what caught her attention wasn't the grandeur, but the emptiness of it. The room was enormous, but there was almost no trace of a life being lived there, not a single framed photograph, not one unnecessary object, not one bit of warm human disorder. It looked more like a fortress than a home, and she suddenly understood that the man who lived here was just as lonely as she was, only in a different way. A large man stepped out of the darkness of the hallway, his hair cut short, his shoulders like a wall, his eyes immediately sweeping over Delia with the cold scrutiny of someone accustomed to assessing every threat in the blink of an eye. "Mr. Frost," the man said, his voice low and rough, his eyes still not leaving her. "I didn't know you had a guest." So now she knew his name, Frost, and somehow that name suited him, cold and sharp. "She's a nurse, Bruno," Frost replied, removing his wet coat. "She's staying tonight." The man named Bruno nodded and asked nothing more, but Delia could feel the vigilance in every movement he made, the way he positioned himself between her and the rest of the room, like a guard dog loyal down to the marrow. She didn't mind it. In fact, it made her feel strangely reassured, because that wariness, at least, was honest. What unsettled her came from another direction. At the end of the hallway, a second man stood leaning against the doorframe, younger, neater, with a courteous smile fixed on his lips like a tie knotted too perfectly. When Frost walked past, the man bowed his head in polite greeting. But in the instant Frost turned his back, his gaze slid after him, and something passed through it that Delia couldn't name. Some cold, calculating glint that vanished so quickly she wondered whether she had imagined it. Then he took out his phone, retreated into a shadowed corner, and began speaking very softly, his back turned to everyone. Delia couldn't hear a word, and she told herself it was none of her business, that in a place like this there must be hundreds of calls like that every night. But the uneasy feeling remained, a tiny grain of grit lodged in her mind, even as Bruno led her through the silent corridors, to the room where she would spend the strangest night of her life. The room assigned to her was smaller than the rest of the building, but it was still larger than anywhere she had ever slept, with a bed covered in spotless white blankets and a window overlooking the sea of city lights. Bruno left her there, telling her to call if she needed anything, then closed the door and withdrew, but Delia couldn't sleep. She changed into the dry clothes that had been laid out on the bed, sat down on the edge of the mattress, and listened to the silence of a strange place. Then, through the wall, she heard footsteps, steady, restless, going back and forth like a caged animal. Frost's footsteps. It went on for hours, and she understood at once that it was the sound of a man who simply couldn't lie still. At last, unable to resist the nurse inside her, she put on her coat, opened the door, and followed the hallway toward the light that was still burning. She found him in a room full of books she suspected were rarely read, standing by the window with a glass of liquor in his hand that had never touched his lips. "You should lie down," she said softly. "Your arm needs rest." He turned back, and under the yellow light, his face looked even more worn than it had out in the rain. "Lying down doesn't do anything," he replied, his voice touched with a bitter kind of self-mockery. "I can't even remember the last time I slept through a whole night." She stepped closer, checked the bandage on his arm again, and he let her do it, as though he was too tired to resist. "You must think I'm insane," he said while she removed the old bandage. A grown man begging a stranger to sit beside him until morning. "I've paid the best doctors in the country. Specialist people wait months just to see. I've swallowed enough medicine to knock down a horse. Some of it made me unconscious, but that wasn't sleep. Some of it did nothing except leave a bitter taste in my mouth. They shone lights into my brain, covered me with wires, then shook their heads and wrote another prescription. None of them helped. So when I saw you out there, soaked through, holding that medical bag as if it were your life itself, I thought maybe someone who was used to sitting watch over others through the night might be different. I don't even know what I was thinking anymore." It was the plea of a man who had run out of road. Delia sat down in the chair across from him, and for the first time since they had met, she looked at him not as a danger, but as a patient. She had seen this kind of exhaustion before, the kind that eroded a person from the inside, turning sleep into an enemy instead of a refuge. "You're not insane," she said. "You're just tired, more tired than medicine can reach." He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, but she could still see clearly that he remained tense, still on guard. And then, almost without thinking, her hand slipped into her coat pocket and took out her mother's stopwatch, the object she had carried with her for years like a charm. She set it on the small table between them, the gesture so familiar that she did it without a thought, because that was what her mother had always done beside the bed of every patient who struggled to sleep, leaving them a steady sound to hold on to. The small ticking filled the quiet room, slow, constant, a rhythm that never hurried and never stopped. She said nothing more. She only sat there in silence, letting that sound fill the empty space between them. And then something strange began to happen. Frost's breathing slowed. His fingers, which had still been tapping with that restless rhythm, gradually loosened. The strained lines on his face softened little by little, like a cord tied too tightly for too long finally being eased open. Delia sat perfectly still, not daring to move, hardly daring to breathe, watching that powerful man sink into sleep right before her eyes. She didn't understand why. She only knew that it was happening, and she sat watch over him all night, as her mother had once taught her to do, until the first light of dawn spilled across the glass windows. When Frost opened his eyes and realized there was sunlight, realized he had truly slept for the first time in 3 long years, he looked at her with an expression Delia would never forget, a look of pure astonishment, almost fear, from a man who had just been given back something he had believed was lost forever. That morning, for the first time since she had stepped into this building, Frost looked like a different man. Not exactly refreshed, because 3 years without sleep couldn't be erased in a single night, but something in his eyes had softened, like water after a storm. He found her in the kitchen, where she was making herself a cup of coffee and trying not to touch anything more expensive than necessary. "I want you to stay," he said directly, without circling around it. "Not for one night. Long term. You'll have your own room and be paid generously, more generously than any hospital has ever paid you. All you need to do is exactly what you did last night." Delia set the coffee cup down, and the old wariness immediately rose inside her, that instinct that had kept her alive through so many streets and so many dark nights. Everything sounded too easy, and in her life, anything that sounded too easy always came with a hidden trap. "You don't even know my name," she said. "Delia Hartwell." He answered at once, making her go slightly still. "Bruno looked you up last night. I know you're a licensed nurse with 5 years in the profession. I know Mercy Hospital let you go 3 weeks ago. I know you don't owe anyone a single cent except for your mother's medical bills, and I know you don't have a roof over your head." She felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to her life being recited so smoothly, as if from a file. "So you know I'm desperate," she said slowly, "and you think that makes me easy to buy." Frost didn't deny it, nor did he seem offended. "I think that means you and I can help each other. You need somewhere to go. I need something this entire fortune can't buy. That's a fair exchange, Miss Hartwell. Nothing more and nothing less." She looked at him for a long time, weighing it. She knew exactly where she was standing. She knew exactly that the man before her lived in a world she didn't understand and didn't want to understand. A world of silent cars, broad-shouldered guards, and streaks of blood at the corner of his mouth that weren't his own. But she also knew the cold of a night on the street, and she knew she couldn't keep wrapping her pride in nights like that forever. "If I stay," she said at last, "it will be on my terms. I'm your nurse, nothing else. I have my own room and a door that locks, and you never cross that threshold unless I give you permission. I take care of you when you need it, but I don't belong to you. I'm not your property, not some object in this building. And whenever I want to leave, I'll leave, without explaining myself to anyone." A brief silence passed, then he nodded. "Agreed." "I'm not finished," she continued, her voice hardening. "I don't want to know what you do to have all of this. I don't ask, and you don't tell me. I mend people's bodies, Mr. Frost. That is my work. Whatever happens outside that door is your business, and I want it to stay out there." She wondered whether he would be angry, but instead, the corner of his mouth only lifted slightly, with that look of near admiration she had glimpsed the night before. "You are the first person in many years who has dared set conditions with me," he said. "Then perhaps it's time someone dared to do it," she replied. They shook hands, the handshake of 2 strangers making an agreement both of them pretended was far simpler than it truly was. And when she released his hand, Delia told herself that she would never let herself forget who this man truly was, that she would keep her heart locked as tightly as the door to her room. The nights that followed settled into a rhythm of their own. And Delia, who had been trained to observe and remember every small symptom in a patient, began to recognize a pattern. She tested it carefully, the way she would trace the source of a fever. On the second night, she kept the stopwatch in her coat pocket and simply sat quietly beside him. And Frost tossed and turned until nearly dawn, his eyes wide open as he stared at the ceiling. On the third night, she placed the watch on the table as she had done that first night, and in less than 1 hour, his breathing had slipped into the deep, even rhythm of real sleep. She did it again and again, not out of idle curiosity, but because she needed to understand, and the result was always the same. It wasn't her presence that allowed him to sleep. It wasn't the room, it wasn't the darkness, it wasn't the exhaustion built up inside him. It was that sound, that small, steady, persistent ticking. Something in its rhythm reached a place deep within him that medicine and machines had never been able to touch. Delia was a nurse, not a psychologist, but she had sat beside enough sickbeds to understand that some wounds did not live on the skin. There were kinds of pain carved so deeply into a person's mind that the body refused to loosen, refused to trust that closing one's eyes could ever be safe. And she began to suspect that this man carried a wound like that, something that had happened in the dark, something that made him afraid to sleep, because of what sleep might take from him. She didn't ask. That was part of their agreement, and more than that, she knew there were doors people had to open on their own, doors that couldn't be pried apart with curious questions. But the answer found its way to her on a night when she wasn't expecting it. He had been asleep for more than 1 hour, his face more peaceful than she had ever seen it, when suddenly his whole body jerked. His breathing turned harsh and frantic, both hands clamped tightly around the edge of the blanket, and before he had fully awakened, a name broke from him, hoarse and shattered. Daniel. Only that one word, but it carried a weight that made Delia go cold. It wasn't the call of a powerful man. It was the voice of a child lost in the dark, the sound of a loss that had never healed. He sat bolt upright, his chest heaving, his eyes staring into empty space, and for one moment he didn't see the room, didn't see her, but saw something from very far away, from very long ago. Delia didn't move. She only reached out and gently pushed the stopwatch a little closer to him, letting that steady ticking sound rise more clearly in the room. And she quietly watched the man return to the present, little by little, his breathing slowing, the panic leaving his eyes. He realized she was sitting there, realized he had just revealed something, and for an instant his face closed itself off in defense, like an animal caught at its weakest. "I'm sorry I woke you," he said stiffly. His voice already returned to its old coldness. "You don't need to apologize," she answered softly. She didn't ask who Daniel was. She didn't ask what had happened. She only sat there in silence, letting that steady sound do its work, and after a long while, he lay back down again. But Delia remained awake for the rest of the night, her heart heavy with the name she had just heard. Daniel, a name spoken with all the love and all the pain a human being could endure. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing for certain, that whatever this man might be in the world outside, somewhere inside him, he was still breaking apart over someone he had lost. She still didn't fully understand how Frost made his living, and she had promised not to ask, but there were some things a person didn't need to ask in order to see. One afternoon, when she accompanied him to a row of aging buildings on the edge of Hadley, where he said he needed to stop by and handle a few matters, she saw it. Frost walked into a small, dusty grocery store, and inside, a middle-aged man named Albert Hance was standing behind the counter, his hands trembling, his face pale as he faced a large man in an expensive coat who was growling threats at him. The man's name was Calvin Rosource, one of the men who worked under Frost, the one who collected debts, and at that moment he was slamming his hand down on the counter, forcing the store owner to pay back twice the amount he had borrowed, threatening to take away the little shop that was everything his family had. Delia saw the shopkeeper's eyes dart quickly toward the room in the back, where a child's soft sing-song voice could be heard, and he hurriedly pulled that door closed, as though trying to build a wall between his child and what was happening. Frost stood silently in the doorway for a moment, watching, and Delia felt the temperature in the room seem to drop by several degrees. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice at all. "Calvin." Just one word, spoken very softly, but the large man jerked as if he had been struck with a whip, spun around, and all the aggression on his face instantly dissolved, replaced by naked fear. "Mr. Frost," he stammered, "I didn't know you were coming. I was only collecting the debt as you instructed, as I instructed." Frost repeated the words, his voice still gentle, but there was something in it that froze the entire room. He stepped forward, one slow step at a time, and the slight limp in his walk didn't make him seem weaker. It made him more frightening, like something that couldn't be stopped. "I told you to collect exactly the amount that had been loaned. I didn't tell you to double it. I didn't tell you to threaten to take away a family's livelihood. And I certainly didn't tell you to come into a place where there was a child and make a father close the door out of shame and fear." Calvin opened his mouth to defend himself, but Frost lifted one hand, and the man fell silent at once. "What do you think power means?" Frost said, and now he was standing close to the man's face, his voice lowered until it was almost a whisper. Yet everyone in the room could still hear every word. "Do you think it means tightening your grip around the throats of people who have nothing to fight you with? A real man never becomes stronger by trampling someone weaker than himself. That isn't strength. That is cowardice wearing the clothing of strength. Calvin nodded shakily, sweat breaking across his forehead. Frost turned to Bruno, who was standing quietly behind him, and gave only a slight signal. Mr. Hance's debt is cleared. All of it. And Calvin will never set foot in this neighborhood again. See to it. Bruno nodded, led the trembling man outside, and everything ended so smoothly that Delia could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. The shopkeeper stood frozen, unable to speak, then began stammering his thanks, but Frost only placed a stack of money on the counter, enough to repair the worn-out little store, then turned and walked away without accepting a single word of gratitude. On the way back in the car, Delia sat in silence and looked at him, her mind tangled with conflicting emotions. She had just felt fear of the kind of power that could make a large man tremble with nothing but the sound of his own name being spoken. But she had also seen something else, something she hadn't expected. Why? She finally asked. Why would you bother with a small shop and a debt that means almost nothing to you? Frost looked out through the window, and it was a long while before he answered, his voice distant. Because I know what it feels like to be crushed under the foot of someone stronger when you have nothing in your hands. I know that feeling better than anyone. And Delia, for the first time, began to understand that this man was far more complicated than the dark world he lived in. There was one thing about her life that Delia had never told Frost, and that was Naomi, the 8-year-old girl she was raising, the child of the sister who had left this world several years earlier, and left Delia the most precious gift of her life. All this time, she had been leaving the little girl with a trusted old friend, saving every dollar she could to care for her. But when Frost learned about it through Bruno, he said only one simple thing, that this building was wide enough for both aunt and niece, and that a child should be with her family. And so, on a sun-filled Saturday afternoon, Naomi set foot in the penthouse for the first time, and she wasn't overwhelmed by its size or luxury the way Delia had feared. Instead, she ran straight to the enormous glass window, pressed her nose against it, and cried out in delight when she saw the whole city tiny beneath them, like a toy box. Aunt Delia. We're up in the clouds, the little girl shouted, and that bright, clear laughter rang through the room that had grown used to silence, melting its coldness the way sunlight melts mist. Frost stood in the doorway, strangely awkward, the man who could make large men tremble with a single look, not knowing what to do before a child. Naomi turned to look at him, her head tilted with the innocent curiosity of childhood, then announced bluntly, "You're so tall. Do you know how to play treasure hunt?" Frost opened his mouth, clearly having no idea what treasure hunt was, and Delia had to fight back a smile at the sight of that powerful man being cornered by an 8-year-old girl. "I'm afraid I've never played," he admitted. "Then I'll teach you," Naomi declared, as though it were the most important thing in the world, then took his large, scarred hand in her tiny one and pulled him away, and to Delia's astonishment, Frost obediently allowed himself to be led. All that afternoon, the penthouse, which had always been as silent as a fortress, suddenly filled with laughter and the sound of running feet. Naomi hid a small pebble she had picked up somewhere and made him search the whole house for it, and Frost, the man who had faced the most dangerous people in the city without blinking, bent down and seriously looked under the sofa in a way so solemn it was almost funny. When she grew tired, the little girl sat flat on the floor with the colored pencils Delia had brought, drawing with deep concentration, her tongue sticking out from one corner of her mouth. A little while later, she ran over to Frost and held out a sheet of paper. "I drew you," she said proudly. On the paper was the figure of a tall man drawn in crooked, childish lines, standing beside a house, and above his head, instead of dark clouds, there was a bright yellow sun with rays shining out in every direction. "Why did you draw the sun?" Frost asked, his voice sounding entirely different. Naomi shrugged, the carefree shrug of a child. "Because you look kind of sad. And sad people need the sun most. My mom used to say that." That innocent sentence hung in the air, and Delia saw something break and heal in Frost's eyes at the same time. The man held the sheet of paper in hands that had once frightened so many people, staring at that clumsy little sun for a long time, and when he looked up, there was a light in his eyes Delia had never seen before. "Thank you, Naomi," he said softly. "I'll keep it. Forever." And he truly kept his word, because that evening Delia caught him carefully placing the drawing on his desk, right where he could see it every day, that small sun shining into the darkest corner of his life. That story was finally told late one night, after Naomi had fallen deeply asleep, when Frost and Delia sat together in the quiet room, with only the ticking stopwatch for company. Perhaps it was the little sun on his desk that had opened a door inside him, or perhaps he was simply too tired of carrying it alone. He began softly, his eyes fixed on empty space, as though he were reading from an old page he knew by heart, every single word, but had never dared read aloud. He told her that he once had a younger brother, Daniel, 6 years younger than him, the only person in this world he had ever truly loved. The two brothers had grown up without a father or mother, leaning on each other in streets that showed no mercy, and Lincoln himself had raised Daniel with his own 2 hands. He had done everything, even the things he wasn't proud of, so his little brother could have food, a place to sleep, and a future. Daniel was the reason he had stepped into this world, the reason he had become hard and ruthless, because he had sworn that he would never let his brother suffer hunger, cold, or fear again. And he had kept that promise. He had built an entire empire, and Daniel had grown into a kind, warm young man, completely different from the dark world his older brother ruled, a young man with a smile that could make people forget their sorrow. But that very world, the world Lincoln had created to protect him, was what finally took Daniel away. He told it in a voice, so even it was frightening, that one night 3 years ago, his enemies had come for him, while the 2 brothers were sleeping in the same house, believing it was the safest place in the world. They came in the darkness, silently, and by the time Lincoln woke, it was already too late. He didn't describe the details of what had happened in those chaotic moments, and Delia didn't need him to, because the pain in his voice had said everything. He told her only about the moment afterward, the moment he held Daniel in his arms, right there on the floor, and fought with hopeless desperation to keep him there. I put my hand on his chest, Frost said, and for the first time his voice broke. I could feel his heart still beating. I kept my hand there, counting every beat, telling myself that as long as I could still count, he was still here with me. I begged him to hold on. I promised him everything. But that heartbeat kept slowing beneath my palm, weakening little by little, until... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Delia sat there, stunned into silence, and in one breathless, painful instant, she understood everything. She understood why he couldn't sleep. Because for him, closing his eyes meant letting go, and letting go meant loss. Every night he drifted into sleep was another night he feared he would wake and find someone gone again, feared that one more moment of his own loosened grip would once again have to be paid for, with the life of someone he loved. And she understood, more deeply than anything, why the ticking of the stopwatch could lull him into sleep when a fortune's worth of medicine could not. Because it was the sound of a steady, unwavering heartbeat, a heartbeat that did not slow, did not weaken, did not fade into silence. It was the sound telling the deepest and most wounded part of him that a heart was still beating right beside him, that tonight he didn't need to keep watch, that tonight no one would leave him. Delia looked at the large man sitting there with the weight of 3 years heavy on his shoulders, and she didn't offer a single hollow word of comfort, because she knew no words could reach that kind of pain. Instead, she only reached quietly across the spaces between them and placed her hand over his, the hand that had once held a dying heartbeat, and she kept it there, warm and steady, until dawn was nearly breaking. After he had poured out his pain, a gentle silence settled between them, and Delia understood that now it was her turn. He had opened his door, and it would be unfair if she kept her own lock tight. She looked down at the stopwatch still ticking on the table, and for the first time, she told him about its true owner. "This belonged to my mother," she began, her fingers lightly touching the metal casing worn smooth by the years. "She was a nurse too, perhaps the finest nurse I've ever known. I grew up in hospital corridors, waiting for her shifts to end, dozing off on plastic chairs. She was the one who taught me everything I know." She told him about the mother who had raised her alone, just as alone as Lincoln had raised Daniel, a woman who believed that healing others was the noblest thing a human being could do. She had taught Delia how to place her fingers on a patient's wrist, how to listen to the story a heartbeat told, how to use this very watch to count each beat and discover what was going wrong inside a body. "She told me that a heartbeat never lies," Delia went on, her voice growing softer, "that when every word could be false, a person's heart would still tell the truth. I believed that my whole life." Then she came to the hardest part, the part she had never told anyone. Her mother had fallen ill, with a disease that came quietly and spread quickly, and though Delia had done everything she could, though she had stayed awake through countless nights beside her bed, using the very hands her mother had trained to try to keep her there, in the end she had still been helpless. "I'm a nurse," she said, and her voice trembled faintly. "I've saved so many strangers, and yet when it was the turn of the most important person in my life, I couldn't save her. I sat there, holding this watch, counting her heartbeat as it slowed, just as you did with Daniel. And I understand that helplessness, that feeling when your hands, the hands meant to heal, still can't hold on to the person you love." As those words left her, something changed in the room. The two of them sat there, a powerful kingpin and a poor nurse, two people who seemed to have nothing in common at all, and yet they were looking into each other's eyes and seeing their own pain reflected back. Both of them had once held a fading heartbeat in their hands. Both of them had tasted that terrible moment when they realized love alone wasn't enough to keep someone alive. Both of them carried a guilt with no name, the lingering belief that surely they should have been able to do more. "So that's why," Frost said softly, his eyes gentle in a way she had never seen before. "That's why you carry it with you, not as a tool, as a piece of her." Delia nodded, and for the first time in a very long while she allowed herself to be honest. "As long as it keeps ticking, I feel as though she's still with me, as though I haven't completely lost her." Frost looked at her for a long time, then said something she had not expected. "Then we're more alike than you think. Both of us are living by the sound of a heart that no longer beats." And in that moment, the final distance between them, that distance of suspicion and caution Delia had so carefully built from the first day, quietly dissolved. Not through a romantic gesture, not through a confession of love, but through something far deeper, the complete understanding between two souls carrying the same wound. But that newly formed closeness did not last long before the brutal reality of Frost's world came crashing in and shattered it. One evening, after Naomi had been sent to spend the night at Delia's friend's house, something went wrong in the building. Shouts rose from the lower floor, footsteps rushed in frantic haste, and when Delia stepped out of her room, she came upon a sight that made her blood turn cold. Bruno and several other men were escorting a stranger down the hallway, the man's face filled with fear, and the air inside the building was thick with a kind of threat she had never felt so clearly before. Frost stood there in the middle of it all, and this time he was not the man who had bent down to search for Naomi's pebble, nor the man who had quietly held her hand until dawn. This time he was something else, cold and distant, a kingpin handling the affairs of the underworld, and Delia suddenly realized that she had forgotten. She had let herself forget who he truly was. She retreated to her room, her heart pounding, and all that night she couldn't sleep. But this time it wasn't because she was worried about him. It was because she was worried about herself, and most of all, because she was worried about Naomi. The next morning, she went to him with her suitcase already packed, her face pale but determined. "I have to take Naomi away," she said, her voice trembling but refusing to retreat. "I'm sorry. I know I promised, I know you've been good to both of us, but last night, I saw it. I saw your world and I can't let a child grow up in a place like this. I can't let her be near the things that could happen here. I swore on my sister's grave that I would keep her safe, and that promise matters more than anything else, even." She left the sentence unfinished, not daring to say the rest. Frost was silent for a long while, and she had prepared herself for anger, for threats, for the power she knew he could use to keep her there, because she had seen him make people obey with nothing but a quiet voice. A man like him, a man who could give orders to an entire city, could absolutely refuse to let her leave. But he did not. Instead, he only nodded slowly, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a deep sadness and an understanding that made her heart ache. "You're right," he said softly. "A child deserves to grow up in the light, not in the dark, and you're a good aunt for putting her above everything else." He turned to Bruno and instructed him to prepare a car to take the two of them wherever she wished, and to make sure she had enough money to begin again, safely, with no strings attached. "I will never stop you from doing what you believe is right," he said. "You came into my life as a free woman, and you will leave as a free woman. I only regret that." He stopped, not finishing the sentence, but she understood. He regretted that his world was not a place where she could stay. Delia took the suitcase and walked toward the elevator, and that should have been the end. But just as the elevator doors were about to close, she suddenly realized something. The man who had just let her go, the man who had not used even a fraction of the power in his hands to keep her there, the man who had placed her freedom and Naomi's safety above his own loneliness, that man was not the darkness she had feared the night before. A truly dangerous man would never have let her leave. Only a man who truly respected her could have done that. And Delia stood there, one hand holding the elevator door, torn between a fear that had taken root deep inside her and a new truth that had just begun to reveal itself, that sometimes the safest place is not the place where there is no darkness, but the place where there is someone willing to protect our light. Delia did not step into the elevator that night, and she stayed, not because she had stopped being afraid, but because she had begun to understand the difference between a dark world and a decent man forced to live inside it. But while the relationship between her and Frost quietly moved into a new chapter, somewhere else within his empire, a storm was silently forming. For a long time, Frost's organization had controlled most of what moved through the Hadley district, and one unbreakable principle of his was that he never involved himself in trafficking anything that could destroy people, especially fake medicine, something he despised down to the bone. So when Bruno reported that a fake drug network was creeping into the area, slipping worthless bottles into small pharmacies and poor clinics, taking advantage of the very people who were suffering most, Frost ordered them to hunt down whoever was behind it. The investigation lasted for weeks, following every lead, every name, every stream of money, until everything pointed to one man. A well-known doctor, a respected face in the city's medical circles. A man who had cleverly used his position both to prescribe deadly medicine and to wash clean the source it came from. His name was Aldous Pike. The night Bruno placed the file on the desk and spoke that name aloud, Frost only read carefully, memorizing every detail about this new enemy, without realizing that the name already carried another meaning inside his own home. It was not until Delia happened to enter the study with a cup of tea, as she often did, and her gaze accidentally passed over the photograph clipped inside the file, that everything broke open. She froze in the middle of the room, the teacup trembling faintly in her hand, and all the blood seemed to drain from her face. Why do you have a photograph of this man?" she asked, her voice so small it was almost impossible to hear. Frost looked up and immediately realized something was wrong. "You know him?" Delia set the teacup down on the desk, her hand shaking so badly she nearly spilled it, and she stared at the face in the photograph, the face that had haunted her nightmares for months. "That is the man who ruined my life," she said quietly. "That is the doctor I reported, the man who prescribed the wrong medicine and caused a patient to die, then used his power and reputation to silence me, to turn me into a liar, to throw me out onto the street." She let out a laugh, a bitter sound with no joy in it at all. "I thought it was only a mistake, an arrogant doctor refusing to admit fault. I never imagined." She could not finish the sentence. Frost sat motionless, and Delia saw something change in his eyes, a rare shock in the face of a man who always controlled every emotion. He stood, took the photograph, and looked at it with an expression she couldn't read. In his mind, two pieces had just locked together in a terrible way. The man he was hunting for poisoning innocent people with fake medicine, and the man who had driven the woman standing before him into homelessness were one and the same. Pike was not merely a link in the criminal chain Frost despised. He was the man who had stolen Delia's honor and livelihood, who had turned a devoted nurse into a woman wandering in the rain with everything she owned packed inside one suitcase. "The patient who died," Frost said, his voice dropping so low it became frightening. "The one you tried to save. That was one of the victims of the fake medicine he was pushing, wasn't it?" Delia looked at him, and that truth slowly emerged in her mind, a truth she had not been able to see while standing alone against the system of power that had protected Pike. She had always thought it was a medical error, but now she understood that the patient had not died because of a mistake. They had died because of greed. And she, the only person who had dared to speak up, had been crushed simply because she had stood in the path of that greed. Frost set the photograph down, and when he lifted his eyes to her, there was a silent promise in them, one more terrifying than any oath. "He will pay," he said. For all of it, it turned out Pike had also sensed that someone was following his trail, and he wasn't the kind of man who sat still and waited. What he feared most wasn't Frost, a man whose face he did not yet know, but Delia. the only person who still possessed something that could bring him down. Because before she was forced out of the hospital, she had managed to save copies of the evidence about the wrong prescription, the mismatched numbers, the records she had quietly protected like a drowning person, clinging to the last piece of broken wood. One afternoon, when Delia went out alone to buy a few things for Naomi, a luxury car glided up beside her, and the window lowered, revealing the face that had haunted her for months. Pike invited her into the car with the polished smile of a man, used to hiding cruelty beneath a courteous surface, and after a moment of hesitation, Delia got in, because she knew that sooner or later, she would have to face him. Inside the car, Pike did not circle around the matter. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, "I think it is time we sat down together like adults. I know you're still holding on to a few documents, and I know life must have been very difficult for you lately." He took out a set of papers and placed them on her lap. "This is an offer. You sign this statement, confirming that your previous accusations were an unfortunate misunderstanding, that you made a mistake under stress. In return, the entire balance of your mother's medical debt will be cleared. Your reputation will be restored. You'll get your job back, even in a better position. You will have back everything you lost, and more besides." Delia looked down at the papers on her lap, and for one moment, temptation closed around her like a cold hand. She thought of the debt weighing on her shoulders, of the nights without a home, of Naomi's future, of everything she could give the child if she would only sign her name. One signature, and all the suffering would end. Her hand lightly touched the pen he offered. But then she thought of the patient who had died, of their face, of how their family must have wept in grief. She thought of the other innocent people who were taking his fake medicine every day without knowing it. And she thought of her mother, of the lesson she had once taught her, that a heartbeat never lies, that some things are more precious than safety and comfort. Slowly she set the pen down and pushed the papers back toward him. "No," she said, and her voice was so steady that even she was surprised. "I won't sign." The smile on Pike's lips stiffened. "You should think very carefully, Miss Hartwell. This is your last chance. You have nothing in your hands. No home, no job, no future. What exactly do you plan to use against me?" "I have the truth," Delia replied, looking straight into his eyes without blinking. "And I have my conscience. You can take away my home, my work, my honor in the eyes of the world. You've already done all of that. But there is one thing you can never buy from me or steal out of me, and that is who I am. If I sign this paper, I'll be betraying the patient who died, betraying everyone you're still poisoning, and betraying the mother who taught me that saving lives is the most sacred thing there is. I would rather live without a penny to my name, and still hold my head high than be rich and have to lower my eyes every time I look in the mirror." Pike looked at her, and for the first time, beneath his courteous mask, something poisonous and dangerous appeared in his eyes. "Then you have just made a very grave mistake," he said softly. The car door opened, and Delia stepped out, her legs trembling but her head still held high, leaving behind everything she might have reclaimed, and carrying with her the only thing she would never trade away, her own dignity. Pike had not been exaggerating when he said Delia had just made a grave mistake, because he wasn't a man who made empty threats, and he understood that to deal with a force like Frost, he needed an eye on the inside, and he already had that eye. For weeks, Frost had sensed that something was wrong, that his enemy always seemed to be one step ahead of him, knowing his moves in advance, anticipating the places he would go. Someone was leaking information from within, and that thought gnawed at him, because his trusted circle was very small, and every name inside it belonged to someone he had once placed his faith in. Bruno was the one who uncovered the truth, after many nights spent quietly tracing every call, every transaction, every suspicious movement. And the name he brought to Frost made the entire room seem to fall silent. It was Gareth Mallory. The young man with the courteous smile always fixed on his lips, the one who had been beside Frost for many years, the one Frost had lifted from obscurity and turned into one of his most capable right hands. It had been him from the very beginning, the man always lingering in shadowed corners, always taking out his phone and turning his back to speak softly whenever he thought no one was paying attention. Frost summoned Gareth, and when the man walked into the room with his familiar smile, Frost only set the evidence Bruno had gathered quietly on the desk. The smile on Gareth's lips slowly went out. "I gave you everything," Frost said, and the most frightening thing was that there was no anger in his voice, only a cold, aching sorrow. I picked you up when you had nothing. I trusted you as I would a brother. I allowed you into my home, let you sit at my table, let you know secrets I told no one else. And you sold all of that to a man's traffics and fake medicine. Why Gareth, knowing there was no point in denying it anymore, revealed his true face, and the false courtesy dropped away like a shattered mask. Because I grew tired of being your shadow, he hissed. You built an entire empire, while I was forever the man standing behind you, running errands for you. Pike promised me something you never would, the chance to be my own master. You talk about loyalty, but loyalty doesn't feed me. Frost looked at him for a long time, and in his eyes, Delia, who was standing silently in the doorway, saw not the rage she had expected, but a deep weariness. The loneliness of a man who had just discovered that even inside his smallest circle, he didn't truly have anyone to lean on. This was the price of the world he lived in, a world where power could buy obedience but could never buy a person's heart. You're wrong, Gareth, Frost said softly, rising to his feet. I never saw you as my shadow. You saw yourself that way. I would have been willing to give you the whole world if you had only asked. But you chose betrayal, and worse, you chose to stand with a man who poisons the innocent. He signaled to Bruno, and his men stepped forward to take Gareth away. Frost didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to lay a hand on him, because the traitor's fall had been decided with nothing more than a silent nod, and Gareth was escorted out to face the consequences of his choice, forever cast out of the world he had betrayed. When only the two of them remained in the room, Frost stood with his back to Delia, his shoulders weighed down beneath an invisible burden. You see, he said, without turning around. This is my world, a place where even the people I care for can drive a knife into my back at any moment. You were right to want to keep Naomi far away from it, but Delia did not leave. Instead, she stepped closer, stood beside him, and quietly placed her mother's stopwatch on the desk, letting its steady ticking fill the heavy silence. You're not alone, she said softly. Not anymore. Before being removed from the game, Gareth had managed to give Pike something invaluable: Frost's schedule and habits, the routes he usually took, the places he often visited without many men at his side. Pike, now knowing who he was up against and understanding that Frost would never let him go, decided to strike first, putting everything into one reckless gamble to eliminate his greatest threat once and for all. That night, before leaving the building, Frost and Delia had taken Naomi to stay at the home of Delia's close friend outside the city, a peaceful place with a wide garden and a gentle dog the little girl loved, completely far away from every danger. Naomi had waved goodbye to them through the warmly lit window, her face bright because she was about to spend the whole weekend playing, entirely carefree and safe, knowing nothing at all about the storm that was about to descend. It was the child's safety that gave Delia the calm she needed to focus on what happened afterward. On the way back, as their car passed through a deserted area between old warehouses, everything happened very quickly. Other cars suddenly surged out to block them from the front and the rear, and in an instant the stillness of the night was torn apart by chaos. Bruno, sitting in the front seat, reacted with lightning speed, shouting for Frost and Delia to get down. It was a carefully calculated ambush, carried out in an isolated place chosen on purpose, far from every watching eye, far from every form of help, a place where calling an ambulance or reaching a hospital was nearly impossible, because Pike had sent men to block every road, and anyone who appeared in public now would become a target. Frost, even in the most desperate situation, kept an astonishing calm. He shoved Delia down onto the floor of the car, covered her with his own body, and gave firm orders to Bruno and the others. In the chaos of the dark night, Frost and his men fought fiercely to force open a way out, and on that thin line between life and death, he did not think of himself for even a second, but only kept making sure Delia was shielded safely behind him. She crouched on the floor of the car, her heart pounding like a war drum, listening as the violent world she had always tried to avoid exploded all around her, and she realized that the man using his own body to protect her was willing to trade everything to keep her safe. At last, after minutes that felt endless, Bruno found an opening, and the car roared forward, breaking through the encirclement and vanishing into the night. They had escaped, or at least Delia thought they had, until she lifted her head and saw Frost's face. In the dim, flickering light cast by the streetlights flashing past, she saw him leaning against the seat, one hand pressed hard against his side, and between his fingers, a dark stain was spreading. He had been shot while shielding her, and he had not said a single word. He had clenched his teeth and endured it so he could get her out of danger first. "Frost," she cried out, fear tightening around her chest. He tried to give her a pale smile, but the color was already draining from his face. "I'm fine," he said, though the weakness in his voice betrayed the words. "As long as you're all right." Bruno's voice came from the front seat, tense and strained, saying they could not go to the hospital, that Pike's men had spread a net everywhere, and were waiting for them to show themselves, that taking Frost there now would be no different from handing him over to death. And in that terrifying moment, as the life of the man she had slowly come to love was slipping away right before her eyes, Delia suddenly realized that the only person who could save him now, in a place with no doctor, no hospital, and nothing but her mother's old medical bag, was her. Something inside Delia rose at once, a cold calm she hadn't known she still possessed, the instinct forged through 10 years beside sickbeds and life or death emergencies. The fear did not disappear, but it moved to the background, making room for the nurse inside her. She ordered Bruno to take them somewhere hidden and safe, anywhere out of Pike's sight, and when the car stopped inside a dark abandoned warehouse, she went to work with her mother's medical bag, the only precious thing now standing between Frost and death. She spread her coat out for him to lie on, tore open the fabric of his shirt to expose the wound, and her hands, the hands that had once trembled helplessly in the rain on the night they met, now moved with a decisiveness and precision that astonished even her. She pressed hard to stop the bleeding, took from the bag the few tools her mother had always told her to carry, and began the battle to wrest his life back from death's hands, right there on the cold floor of an abandoned warehouse, with no machines, no surgical lights, no one to assist her, only herself and everything her mother had taught her. "You have to stay awake, do you hear me, Frost?" she said, her voice both commanding and pleading. "Don't close your eyes, look at me." But his face was growing paler and paler, his breathing shallower and shallower, and Delia felt terror rise inside her as she realized he was slipping away from her. And then, almost by instinct, she did the thing her mother had taught her, the thing she had done 1,000 times, but never with a heart this important. She pulled out the stopwatch, placed her fingers against his neck to find his pulse, and began to count. The steady ticking echoed through the dark warehouse, and beneath her fingertips, she felt his heartbeat, weak, slow, but still there. And in that moment, a terrible and painful truth came crashing into her. She suddenly understood, down to the marrow of her bones, the feeling he had carried inside him for 3 long years. Because now she was the one sitting there with her hand on a fading heart, counting each beat as though as long as she could still count, that person would still remain with her. Now she was the one who didn't dare look away, didn't dare blink, afraid that even one loosened moment would be enough to steal him from her forever. Now she was the one begging a heart not to stop beating, bargaining with fate, pouring all her love and all her will into keeping one person in this world. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her hands did not tremble. "Don't leave me behind," she whispered, bending close beside him, still counting, still pressing hard against the wound, still doing everything she could. "Do you hear me, Lincoln Frost? I haven't given you permission to go anywhere. We still have a whole life ahead of us to heal each other. Naomi still needs you. I still need you. So you have to stay. You have to fight. You have to show me that this heartbeat isn't a lie." And as if in answer to her, as if the sound of the watch and the sound of her voice had anchored him to life itself, the heartbeat beneath her fingertips slowly steadied. It no longer weakened, but began to grow stronger little by little. The blood had stopped flowing beneath her skilled hands. His breathing, though still shallow, had become even again. She had held on to him. With everything her mother had left her, with the old medical bag and the stopwatch, and 10 years of devotion to her profession, the woman once rejected by the entire city had won back the life of the most powerful man she had ever known, right there in the darkest and most desperate place. And as she sat there, holding him in her arms on the cold warehouse floor, listening to his heartbeat return to a steady rhythm, alongside the ticking of the watch, she understood that fate had given her a chance it had never given him, the chance to save the person she loved. When the immediate danger had passed and Bruno found a safe place to take him, a discreet house where Delia could care for him without fear of Pike's men discovering them, the hours that followed passed in a waiting so tense it felt almost suffocating. She did not leave his side for even half a step. She sat beside his bed through the night, changed his bandages, watched every breath, and placed the stopwatch right beside his pillow, so that familiar ticking would stay with him, even when he sank into fevered unconsciousness. She had stayed awake through many nights beside sickbeds in her life, but no night had ever been as long as this one. No night had ever made every breath of another human being mean so much to her. She held his hand, the hand that had once made so many people tremble, now lying motionless and weak in hers, and she softly told him, though she did not know whether he could hear her or not, about the ordinary things she hoped they would do together once he recovered, about teaching Naomi to ride a bicycle, about morning coffee, about all the small things she had never dared dream of until he stepped into her life. And when the first rays of dawn slipped through the gap in the curtains, she felt his fingers move faintly in her hand. She looked up sharply, her heart catching in her throat, and saw his eyelids slowly opening. For a moment, his gaze was still hazy and lost, as though he was searching for the road back from a very distant place. Then those eyes found her, stopped on her face, and something inside them softened, becoming clear. Delia waited, tears already on the edge of spilling over, waiting for him to say something, to ask whether he was still alive, to say something about Pike, about the wound, about his own safety. But he said none of those things. Instead, Lincoln Frost looked at her, the woman who had sat watch over him through the long night the way he had once longed for someone to do, the woman who had not left him, the woman who was still there when he woke, and his dry, cracked lips moved faintly as he breathed out 3 words, only 3 words, yet they held an entire world. "You're still here." It was not a question. It was a truth he was telling himself, a miracle he needed to speak aloud in order to believe it was real. Because for 3 long years, every time he closed his eyes, he had lived with the fear that when he opened them again, the person beside him would be gone, that he would wake once more into loneliness and loss. He was used to waking up and finding an empty space. But this time was different. This time he opened his eyes, and she was still there. The tears Delia had been holding back all this time finally rolled down her cheeks, but they were tears of an emotion she could find no words to name, a mixture of relief, happiness, and a love so deep it made her ache. "Yes," she answered, her voice breaking as she tightened her hand around his. "I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long time, and in that gaze was everything the two of them had never said aloud, all the confessions of love they had never spoken, because between them, love had never been a matter of words. It was presence. It was staying. It was one person sitting watch while the other slept through the darkest night, one hand holding on to a fading heartbeat and refusing to let go. He gently squeezed her hand, the pressure weak but filled with meaning, and in that small room washed with dawn, with the stopwatch ticking steadily beside his pillow, 2 people who had once been broken quietly found a place of peace in each other, needing no greater promise than the 3 simple words that had just been spoken. When Frost was strong enough to sit up, the two of them did together what Delia would never have been able to do alone. The evidence she had protected for months, the forged prescriptions, the careful records, the mismatched numbers she had quietly copied before being forced out of the hospital, combined with everything Frost's organization had uncovered about Pike's fake drug network, created something that even his power and money could no longer bury. This time, Delia was no longer standing alone before a system that shielded powerful men. This time, her voice was amplified by undeniable evidence, placed into the right hands, hands capable of making it thunder. The truth about what Pike had done, about the innocent people who had paid with their health and their lives for his greed, was finally brought into the light. The empire of lies he had worked so hard to build collapsed, and for the first time, the man who had grown used to standing above others had to face his own consequences, stripped of everything he had once used to trample others beneath him. For Delia, justice did not come in the shape of revenge, but in the shape of truth restored to its rightful place. Her name was cleared, and the honor of the devoted nurse she had paid such a high price to protect was finally restored. Those who had once turned their backs on her now had to admit that she had been right from the beginning, that the woman they had cast aside had in fact been the only one brave enough to speak the truth. But what warmed her heart most was not that vindication, but the fact that the death of the patient she had failed to save was no longer meaningless. Their passing had become the thing that exposed a crime, had saved so many others from the same fate, and in that way, She felt that at last she had fulfilled her duty to the person she had once watched leave this world while she was helpless to stop it. For Frost, Pike's collapse carried another meaning, one far deeper. For 3 years, he had lived like a man trapped between the past and the present, carrying a sentence he had pronounced upon himself. Believing Daniel's death was his fault. Believing that his own moment of loosened vigilance had killed the brother he loved most. He had punished himself every night with sleepless hours, with the fear of closing his eyes, as though denying himself sleep was the way to atone. But the night he was shot while shielding Delia, and the moment he woke to find her still beside him, something inside him changed. He realized that he could not change the past, could not bring Daniel back, but he could choose not to let that past imprison him forever. One night, as the two of them sat together watching the city lights come on, he spoke to her in a voice touched with a relief she had never heard from him before. "I spent 3 years punishing myself because I couldn't save him," he said. "I thought that if I allowed myself to sleep, allowed myself to have peace, it would mean I had forgotten him, that I had betrayed him. But I was wrong. Daniel would never want me to live like this. He would want me to live, truly live." Delia rested her head against his shoulder, and she understood that he was saying goodbye, not to the brother who had passed away, but to the burden of guilt he had carried for far too long. "He would be proud of you," she said softly. "Proud of the man you've become. Proud of the man you've chosen to become." And for the first time since that fateful night, Frost felt he could close his eyes without fear. Not because some king was keeping watch over him, but because he had finally forgiven himself. Many months had passed since that fateful night, and on a clear autumn morning, golden sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, shining into the home that had now truly become a home. It was no longer the cold, empty fortress Delia had stepped into on that rainy night long ago. Now it was filled with laughter and the warmth of a family. In the kitchen, Naomi was sitting on a high chair, swinging her legs, eating cake while chattering on and on about a long, endless story from the dream she had had the night before, and the child's bright laughter rang out like the most beautiful music, filling every corner of the house. Delia stood by the stove, making 2 cups of coffee, smiling as she listened, her heart filled with a peace she had once thought she would never be able to touch. And in the next room, Lincoln Frost was still asleep. The man who had once gone 3 long years without being able to close his eyes, who had once paced through the night like a trapped animal, now lay there with a peaceful face, his breathing deep and even, sunk in a full and quiet sleep. On the small table beside the bed, Delia's mother's stopwatch was still ticking steadily, faithfully, that small sound that had once been the bridge that led him back to sleep, now a silent companion through his peaceful nights. But now Delia understood that it was not the watch that had healed him, not truly. That ticking had only been the beginning, the first thing that told his wounded heart he was safe. What truly healed him was everything that came afterward, the feeling of having someone beside him, the knowledge that when he closed his eyes in the night, he would not wake into loneliness, the quiet and enduring love of a home where he belonged. She stepped into the room, set the cup of coffee down, and quietly watched him sleep for a little while longer before waking him. As though he sensed her presence, he slowly opened his eyes, and this time there was no panic, no lost look, only a gentle smile forming on his lips when he saw her, then looked toward the kitchen, where Naomi's laughter was still drifting in. "Good morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep but warm. "Good morning," she answered, and in that simple moment, no power, no fortune, no empire in this world could compare with what they had. Because at last, after all the breaking and all the loss, those 2 once shattered people had found the one thing money could not buy and power could not seize, a peaceful place to belong, a hand to hold in the darkness, and a reason to wake each morning with a smile. And if Delia's life had taught her anything, it was that kindness, no matter how small, no matter how quietly it was given on the coldest rainy night, always found its way back, and that sometimes, in the very moment we believe we have lost everything, we find the most precious thing we have spent our whole lives searching for. Because what heals the deepest wounds in the human soul has never been power or wealth, but the feeling of being safe, being understood, and being loved by someone willing to stay beside us, even through the darkest night. If the story of Delia and Lincoln has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories to more people every day. We truly hope to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart, so don't hesitate to leave a comment and tell us how this story made you feel, what moved you the most, and what lesson you have taken from it for yourself. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very final moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, peace in your hearts, and many simple joys in your everyday lives. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.